and welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're talking to Jared of Cyber Dandy. And we are also going to be speaking largely on existentialism and a little bit on existentialism, anarchism, and existentialism, and then leftism, and maybe implications for the post-Biden left. But let's start off with the obvious question in the room. Since existentialism is generally the modernist de jure philosophy that if you're a high schooler, frankly, you encounter first, there seems to be a complicated context to the fact that it becomes pretty unpopular pretty quickly. So why do you think existentialism, both in its historical array and in most people's encounter with it, gets dropped off as a kind of radical analysis?
So to begin with, I think you're right. It is, at least if you're talking about Nietzsche, existential, it is basically the first doorway into philosophy people wind up going through. But it's the entire history, if we're going to look at Kierkegaard forward, is never quite comfortable with a lot of philosophy on the left. And some of that is the way that existentialists respond to Hegel, Kierkegaard, or Stirner. The other one is just it doesn't sit right with the objectivity framework that a lot of Marxists and leftists want to base their philosophy on. So you have a philosophy that's uncomfortable to begin with. And then when it starts becoming politically applied in France by Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and the circle around modern times, they never really become close friends with the Communist Party. They actually were attacked pretty systematically by the PCF.
Which is kind of ironic, given that we always think of Sartre as, breaking with Camus over defending the communist, and then it seems that almost immediately the French Communist Party declared them like personas non grata theoretically pretty quickly.
Yeah, and even that breakup with Camus is not very well understood by a lot of people. What happened is a report came out in France about the work camps in Russia, and no one quite knew what to do about that information. They were Sartre and Camus were both on the side of working class struggle one way or another, and had mostly been comfortable with the Communist Party and what was going on in Russia. But when that information came out, basically Sartre said, okay, let's not feed into the capitalist propaganda that's going to be a result of that report. And Camus said, no, we have to publish about this immediately, and we have to condemn it. And that was the argument. So neither of them thought the camps were a good idea, or even thought they were necessary. It was about how to handle the information publicly.
So you also kind of blame the structuralist turn for a decline in interest in existentialism. Would you like to go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So existentialism really came to dominate France for the whole post-war period up until basically 1968, where a lot of what the left thought was possible was suddenly shown to be incorrect, and students and workers came together and had a little rebellion. But after that point, it was there's already a loss of confidence in the Communist Party in France after Hungary, and a lot of a lot of the French intellectuals started condemning Stalinism after that. But the structuralists and the post-structuralists felt sort of like they needed to understand history in a different way that didn't come out of class analysis. So that's where you get stuff like Foucault, who's trying to understand like changes in the fundamental, epistemic truth of society, or an analysis of power. And along with that new way of analysis came a rejection of the idea of the subject and a rejection of Enlightenment humanism. And those were both points on which the new French intellectuals tried to distance themselves from existentialism and attack Sartre. A lot of those attacks were not well read. They were misunderstandings a lot of the time, but I think a big part of it was they just needed to free the air up of the great dominance of the French intellectual.
Right. So you basically, what, as Pierre Badiou would say, one group of intellectual social capital terrorists took out another group of intellectual social capital terrorists, which is one cynical way to look at it. Another more interesting way is that there's a political motivation behind the break with existentialism in terms of the humanism, anti-humanism debates. And what I find interesting about this is when you hear the humanist, anti-humanist debates reframed to Marxism now, no one even mentions the existentialists, even though, like, when you think about the university context of like Althusser and whatnot, how can you not? Like, and yet it makes it seem like the issue is either Khrushchev or it's like the Frankfurt School, or it's Gramsci, who does have a lot of overlaps with the existentialist Marxist. But it's not like, it is interesting that even in our recounting of this debate, we don't even really recount the debates. The humanist debates are actually kind of squarely aimed at existentialism in the context of the French university in specific, right? So,
right.
And I think some people do this because they don't want to deal with the fact that so much of this, like, Marxism is frankly an academic debate almost completely, with occasional like forays to the French Communist Party. But I mean, Althusser has his problems with that too later on. So it's not like structuralism and post-structuralism get the okay. And by the time you get to Foucault, you're not, like, no one thinks they're really Marxist anymore.
Yeah, well,
go ahead.
So I, my Althusser knowledge is not very well developed, but what I definitely understand the post-structuralist arguments more, and I've read a lot more of that work. And so the way that they critique existentialists for humanism is based on a misunderstanding of what Sartre actually thought about humanism, which he had a whole handful of types that he wrote about, most popularly in Nausea, where he condemned various types of humanism, but he thought of his own philosophy as something like a humanism, but not based on any kind of notion of the self or the subject, which he rejects. And
there's no meaningful inherent subject, even if there's like something like a biological being that's not the same as a subjectivity at all, and so existence thus comes before essence, right?
Right. And that's the other thing. A lot of so not only are the post-structuralists sort of like attacking a straw man, but a lot of what they actually are saying can be found in Sartre. And then you see this with the Situationist International as well. I mean, they're called that based on Sartre's concept of the situation. It's not just a random term they picked.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you a little bit more about that because of the situationist like weird relationship to both like proto-autonomia and left communism, that we forget its specifically French context. And thus we forget its specific relationship to existentialism, hence in which the name. And again, like we said in the beginning, this always strikes me as odd because of the European philosophies that are tied to Marxism that you're gonna encounter, the French existentialists are the first ones you do. I mean, like they're literally the only Marxists that I know anyone who read anything about in high school, like other than maybe someone who read the manifesto directly for a class once. Like,
yeah, and then there's also another. If you're going to talk about Americans,
we'll get back to that. But, but yes, go ahead. But maybe finish your current statement. I just want to circle around. Our understanding of this comes through what?
Well, through like decades old source material. Most of the work that Sartre wrote on Marxism was published in like the late 60s. Was the first volume of the Critique of Dialectical Reason. The second volume wasn't published in English until the 90s.
Right.
And then the academic secondary literature on both those works is like you could read all of it in a week.
Well, you know what's funny about that? I mean, to be fair to like the post-structuralists, in their heyday too, right? In the heyday of like Foucault dominating, English history departments, etc., and to some degree, Foucault studies still do. Although I feel like sometimes people read Foucault to build the better panopticon, but that's a whole different rant. It was surprising how little Foucault was translated into English when I was actually studying this in the heyday of Foucauldian new historicism. So, like, we are still waiting on volume 4 of the history of sex, or the Christian volume of the history of sexuality.
Right. Yeah. It's like a month or two away, but yeah.
Yeah. We didn't have the Lectures de France, which are super important, completely translated until I was in my 30s. Like, and yet we had a burgeoning Foucault industry like when I was in high school. So there is an interesting way in which like a lot of these European intellectuals, for languages that are commonly spoken and we have ready access to, this is the confusing thing. Because not like it's hard to find people who can translate French.
Right.
I mean, like French is a highly context specific language that leads to a lot of weird translations in English. Totally true, but it's not like there's not plenty of French speakers. It's taught in most high schools in the United States. So like why do we have so little of this work, do you think?
I don't know. It's some of it also has to be I just don't know, because even Foucault one of his first published works was a long introduction to this existential psychoanalyst called Ludwig Binswanger. And the book is called Dream and Existence. This is like, Foucault's analysis of phenomenology is that work. There's going to be some unpublished stuff coming out that he wrote, they found in his notes, but there's a direct connection between existentialism flowing right into the post-structuralist theory that for whatever reason, the academics that are researching this stuff just are allergic to it.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, like, I literally used to see, back before my Marxist days, even when I was a conservative, I could just pull out tons and reams of secondary material on this stuff. And yet key parts of it are not translated and also under discussed in the secondary literature too. So it's like, I always feel like I'm getting an incomplete version. It's one of the things where, like, you might not know this, Jared. My bet nar is Althusser. Like, I'm in an internal like crusade against Althusser that everyone knows about. But but I'm always finding that my understanding of Althusser is somewhat limited by the fact that a lot of it actually is poorly translated, and the people who I respected who were critiquing Althusser are actually critiquing sort of English, English receptions of him in the 70s that may not be entirely accurate to what he actually thought. Mm-hmm. And this seems like an academic problem, except that a lot of people who are not academics now, for both good and ill, this being confined to critical theory departments and subsets of the English department or history department, have broken open in the last decade and a half. Like, the stuff that I was studying in college became Twitter speak, for good and ill, So, in some sense, like, you can go to Barnes and Nobles anywhere in the country and go get a Foucault book, or a Sartre book, still to this day. And then, like I said, Sartre and Camus are one of these philosophers that you often read in high school and are often embarrassed that you did. Like, this is another thing that I can describe my own cycle with this, where I have only come out recently and been like, no, I was obsessed with Camus when I was in 9th grade. Before I even knew how to say his name was Camus. Like, I would call him Camus. Like,
but what was your introduction to Camus?
The literature, actually, not the philosophy, right?
Right. Like, and I think this plays into a lot of the misinterpretation of French, existentialism, specifically because they were so damn literate. The plays and the novels that they were writing, all of them. Well, I don't know about Merleau-Ponty, but
right.
That is how a lot of Americans came to understand what existentialism is. And as a series of literary tropes, it doesn't really give you the background that's like rooted in Hegel and Husserl and just like this really complicated systematic analysis of what experience is like. So yes, people are embarrassed to read The Stranger. It's like right up there with 1984 and Animal Farm and
all those books that you were assigned in high school. I mean, and yet, and I also remember reading, say, The Rebel or The Myth of Sisyphus without additional context. And without a lot of context, frankly, particularly in The Rebel, you can read Camus as sounding like Jordan Peterson, which is wild, because that's not what, even at the time, even at his most, quote, conservative, he was not heading in that direction. But that's what it sounds like without context.
Well, it's funny you say that, because Jordan Peterson is one of the very few people on YouTube who I have seen even talk about existential psychoanalysis. He has like 5 lectures or something on it. They're terrible. They don't actually discuss what Medard Boss or Sartre or Binswanger were really saying, but for being a Jungian, he has definitely dove into the existentialist waters pretty deeply. And I think that could be what you're even picking up on. I mean, there is definitely influence there. The whole humanistic psychology movement is deeply influenced by existentialism, period. So
this is a good pivot, and we'll come back to Situationism and we'll come back to America, but there's just so much stuff coming out of this. One thing I wanted to ask you is the humanistic psychology movement has kind of interesting fallen out of favor with both. How do I say this nicely? The way in which old forms of psychology are used by English departments as kind of an elephant graveyard for psychological theories. So, like, when you want to go to die, you go and get applied to novels. But this also keeps things like psychoanalysis, particularly classical and Lacanian psychoanalysis, sort of alive beyond their somewhat limited clinical use. This is not to say that there's no clinical use for classical or Lacanian psychoanalysis. I don't want to like make those statements. That's clearly not true, but that there's not that much. Whereas humanistic psychology hasn't suffered that fate, but it also does not seem to have been picked up the way positivistic psychology or some of the more optimistic forms of cognitive behavioral therapy and whatnot have been picked up in the United States. Why do you think that is? And does it have political implications?
Well, a big part of it is exactly the experimental usefulness of CBT. Humanistic psychology, part of it, and positive psychology, they share the same ancestors, like Abraham Maslow and Hierarchy of Human Needs, and his later work is all about how to reach like peak human experiences, which leads all into the flow garbage, basically, that you see in the positive psychology movement. So it's alive still in that way. So there, but anyway, CBT, you could test it. It's modular. Its programs are, studied like statistically for results. Talk therapy in general has not necessarily been favored statistically for its successes.
Yeah, I was about to say it doesn't have a lot of what we would consider statistical evidence for any kind of efficacy. Although, to be fair, neither has a lot of other psychology when they try to retest it. So
right, or even psychiatry.
Right. That's a disturbing thing, but yes.
But then the other thing I think is how useful has whatever form of psychology been to the business environment, to the corporation, and to human resources and those kind of applied settings. So industrial psychology, organizational psychology. And that's where you start seeing, I think, a reinforcement of certain biases in the field. Because really what they don't want, if you're a business, you're really not trying to solve your employees' deep existential problems. You're trying to, make sure that they're better scientifically managed workers.
They would have very little interest in actually solving the deeper problems because it might actually demotivate them to continue the rat race in such a way. So this is interesting. Get to your politics, though. I mean, you're obviously very influenced by humanistic psychology. You're very influenced by existentialism. You consider yourself kind of in the anarchist socialist spectrum, right? I'll let you define yourself there, but
yeah, I'm very, very long-term committed anarchist. But I've always, my introduction and my ongoing interest in anarchism is more tied to like post-World War II British anarchism, like Herbert Reed or Colin Ward, than it is to, or like Paul Goodman in the United States, than it is to like Bookchin or even Stirner, or any of the really popular anarchists with anarchists. I have not gotten a lot out of them, and this is going to come up later when we talk about some other things. But Colin Ward is kind of like my hero.
So I know Colin Ward from a long history in anarchism that I actually think is quite good. And that's really my exposure to Colin Ward, but it's interesting when you contrast that to like the 90s Bookchin Bob Black debates, and then the anarchist movement being associated with Occupy, Paracon, kinds of post-Marxism, the anti-globalization movement in the 90s. And then this other set of anarchism that's really associated with primitivism and the first group of people who use the term post-left, which is now hard to use because a whole different group of people with no relationship to that group use the same term.
which I have not wrapped my head around that yet. But
yeah, I know. I mentioned talking about the new post-left Social Democrats once, and you were like, "Who are they?" And I'm like, we have to have a discussion about how this term has changed."
Yeah. Well, and then one group you're leaving out, which has been a big influence locally for the people I've been working with, is insurrectionary anarchism that comes out of Italy and is closely related to autonomism and situationist.
The insurrectionary anarchism that comes out of Italy has another reason with France. And I am more familiar, and you and I have been long interlocutors on the interwebs, so people know that there are some back history here. But I've been long kind of studying and critiquing communization theory, which is adjacent to that, but not that. Like it comes out of, on one hand, it comes out of anarchists discovering Marxist left communism, and on the other hand, it comes out of Marxist left communists discovering insurrectionary anarchism.
Yeah, that was a lot of people are influenced by that. I don't know anymore, but they were like 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff has really faded out of favor in the United States, partially because after Occupy, people became more interested in more statist forms of Marxism, frankly, and more explicitly statist forms of Marxism, forms that, social democracy, Marxist-Leninism, the increasingly capitalist concessionatory variants of late Maoism, which is also very interesting because I've literally seen in my lifetime the dominant subcultural strain of Maoism change to like an almost opposed view, and in a very short period of time. So when I was encouraging J. Paul Malfwad to publish his book on Maoism, he was writing about Third Worldism, MLM, Mao Zedong thought, and by the time that book got published, everything was moving back to pro-China, Dengist adjacent positions, whereas all the Maoists that I had known prior to 2015, almost all of them were bigger China critics than I was, by a lot.
And how familiar are you with the French Maoists,
I'm fairly familiar with the divisions, although I haven't kept up with them contemporaneously. So my knowledge of them kind of fades around the 80s.
Yep. Okay. Me too. But yeah, I do think it's interesting that you had that whole gauche proletariat, or what it was like the left of the left, basically, who their notion of what Maoism was some kind of anti-authoritarian cultural I don't want to say cultural Marxism, but a cultural revolution. And then you had Althusser.
Yeah, you had Althusser's version of it, which was, one of the things about Althusser's Maoism is actually, other than the way he talks about science, which if you know Stalinist Kant, you actually know what it's doing. There's not a whole lot of tells. It's actually hard to figure out his actual relationship to Maoism. That's why I've started meeting Althusserian social democrats, which is a wild thing to me. And I also remember the rise in the aughts of in the Cliffite spear of Trotskyism, the Althusserian Trotskyists, which was also a wild development that I couldn't understand. I was like, but these two things are not like the other. They literally contradict each other on fundamental things. So yeah, it's I think this is all this is interesting because it shows how given to weird, basically social fads that a lot of this stuff is subjected to. So you've been trying to resurrect existentialism as a serious left, let's say, rubric of a way to at least interpret left action. I can't say that it's caught on.
No.
But why did
and it's been 10 years. I mean, this is not a new project at all.
No. I've known you being the existentialist in some form or another for about a decade. But I think our dialogue at least goes back to 2012 or something. So it's why do you think it is not why? Despite the interest in existentialism, which I don't think has gone away, like I still find popular introductions to existentialism that are like decent sellers on whatever, like you go into Amazon, you can find them. Yet it seems like it's treated as pop philosophy, not as anything that has anything to say about politics now. And it's often kind of associated almost with like the more sophisticated version of, I don't know, something stupid like objectivism, like, Andronian objectivism or something, like, because of a couple of premises in the beginning that seem similar metaphysically, like there is no, imposed non-biological essence, etc. and so forth. But like, that's about it. Why do you think it is, despite its continued popularity, totally depoliticized?
Well, the beat culture is part of that, right?
I wasn't expecting that. Go into that more.
Well, a lot of the people who were initially fans in the English-speaking world of existentialism were part of the beatnik and then hippie culture, and it gained that coffee house moodiness. I mean, a lot of people might call that goth now, but back then it was, you were reading Being in Nothingness, and that was like kind of your cultural persona.
Yeah. And because of superficial words like emptiness, equating it to Buddhism and other weird, complete misreadings of both philosophies. But
it's the cultural, it's the way that it became such a cultural item in the 60s that also allows it to be, in hindsight, viewed as a passing moment of the history of just consumer culture. So, but that's not true in the Arab world. I mean, there's other places we could talk about existentialism. The Arab world wasn't.
Where do you think it's gone? So you think it's really dominant in the Arab world? I can tell you just as an anecdote to back up what I think you're about to say. I found tons of that stuff translated into Arabic from English and French when I was in Cairo. So
yep, it was huge. Sartre fucked it up by supporting Israel. That's what happened. The second that Sartre came out and was favorable towards Israel during a time when he was trying to have a conversation both with I think some people in Egypt, and they started burning his books, and they were really let down by that.
Yeah, Egypt coming out as a Zionist isn't going to go well.
No. Yeah. So that, unfortunately, that has had a lasting impact, and also, just the whole zeitgeist of the Arab world is different than it was in the 60s. I mean, it's not as socialist or as,
Yeah, Pan-Arabism has largely collapsed, and Saudi oil money has funded resurgences and different variant forms of Salafi and Wahhabi. More Salafi. I mean, Wahhabism is kind of specific to Saudi Arabia, but and if people don't know enough about Islam to know about what Salafi is, it's to say it's fundamentalism is actually not correct. But it is a more Islam as a way of life and law. And there are various degrees of it. Like there are Salafists that I met in Cairo who I actually say would be pretty modern. Maybe the equivalent for people in the United States would be like modern Orthodox Jews, which I guess also is not going to help a lot of people. But yes, I mean, but I say modern Orthodox as opposed to Hasidim or Haredi, and so. modernist Islam, which was super liberal, has kind of fallen out of favor. But also, what's interesting is the Islam of North Africa in specific was always kind of liberal. And there is actually kind of a tension between Salafist and like Egyptian, Algerian traditionalists in the area, because like Sufi saints and all that stuff is a big deal in North Africa, and Salafists don't want any of that. So that tension's, I know this seems off of existentialism, but that tension's really there. But it also still, existentialism still has a rebellious edge. And so when you meet educated Egyptians, they often are conversant in it now. Like it's still a thing. So
yeah, and from what I read, I mean, it was, the second largest following of existentialism was in the Arab world. It was not, second to France. It was not in other European countries, which is interesting because half of existentialism comes out of Germany with Karl Jaspers and Heidegger. And
yeah. I mean, but what's interesting, I think, is the German and Scandinavian existentialists are associated with, in Scandinavia, they're associated with Christianity, and in Germany, they were associated with Nazism. So
yeah, and then the ones that weren't came to America, the Frankfurt School.
Right.
Erich Fromm, I have never been able to convince myself that he's an existentialist, but the guy wrote, on the same themes. To have and to be is, Sartre has a chapter in Being and Nothingness called Being, Having, Doing, or something like that. It's like the same thing. Yeah. And then, Martin Buber, and there's a whole like Jewish existentialist school, obviously did not hang around in Germany during the Nazis.
Well, some people seem to be coming late because they're asking most existentialism seems like poetry, and I'm like, well, the Critique of Dialectical Reason is not a poetic text, like at all.
No.
And neither would be anything by Monty Parley. I think it is sort of the legacy is dampened in America by the fact that your exposure is through Sartre's literary text. And as we said, that a lot of his philosophical texts were not completely translated till very late, and its association with beat culture. It's association. The other thing we have to talk about the Situationists, and maybe this is a good point to come back to that. The Situationists are interesting in that they're both an artistic and a political movement, explicitly. But I think in America, if you're not a 68 fetishist, you associate, like my encounters with Situationism before I was on the left was in art classes, right?
Wow. Okay.
About the history of modernists transitioning into postmodern art. And, a long history there going back to like even stuff like the Dada school. Like if you know, like some of the techniques that the Situationists were using to generate slogans and stuff, it was similar to Dadaist art, although it had a very different political valence. Dadaism, some of those guys became communists, but a lot of them became super reactionary or religious or just didn't survive the war. Right. So it's the Situationist reception in America, though, it does seem to be largely based off of one text, outside of the art discussions, and that is the Society of the Spectacle, and that's usually read not completely contextualized. So, how do you think that's hurt, like, the understanding of the relationship between existentialism and these other French ideological schools?
Absolutely. First of all, the Situationists they might have named themselves after that concept in Sartre's writing, but they were not happy about Sartre. They did not like the figure of the public intellectual at all. And part of their critique of society was a critique of that position. So there was that, but a lot of anarchists, especially in the post-left anarchist quadrant, are heavily influenced by the Situationists. And
just let me pause
there's
for newbies who don't remember the context of 10, 15 years, 20 years ago. Post-left here is Bob Black. I guess some of the proto-primitivists, early Saracen. Who else would really Hyken Bay? But we don't like to talk about him anymore for obvious reasons.
Right.
Who else would be left?
Well, you had you had like basically three main subclasses that were post-left. Like you said, the proto-primitivists, so Zerzan. And then there's always been a green anarchist, non-primitivist, and sometimes oriented towards indigenous struggle part of it. And then you had the Bob Black, more like punk rock nihilist part of it.
Who has called me a Stalinist for saying that there were hierarchies in hunter-gatherer societies sometimes.
Which is bizarre because he has made that argument himself.
I know. He just did, I think he realized I was a Marxist and didn't like me.
Yeah.
I mean, Bob Black's
unfriended
wild.
me. He unfriended me recently for posting a Chomsky video, which I'm not a big Chomsky fan. So,
yeah, that's for someone who's always talking about pluralism and whatnot. It's real thin. How easy it is to piss some of these people off. But to get back, get out of left gossip, I think one of the things that's hard to remember about the anarchist post-left is that it really wasn't in all cases a turn to, you might argue that some forms of primitivism are, even Derick Jensen would probably, even I was just thinking about who I would argue about this for, but even like John Saracen would argue that some forms of primitivism took a turn towards the reactionary, Jensen at one level, and then at the extreme level, you have like the most radical ends of things like Atasha.
Which I was kind of going to say the ITS,
right,
Mexico,
right.
Also, I don't know why I said three. The insurrectionary anarchists, I think, pretty much considered themselves post-left until about 10 years ago. And then there's, my friend Aragorn, who's no longer with us, was also a central figure in all that with Anarchy Magazine and later Little Black Card and all these other projects, Anarchist News. That world has been shaped by a very situationist-oriented concept of anarchism. A big reason why is the punk rock connection, because I don't know if you know this, but the guy who put the Sex Pistols together,
Malcolm McLaren, yes,
he was earlier, before he opened up that shop, Sex. He was part of a group called King's Mob, and King's Mob were a post-situ group. So there's the beginning of punk rock was in some ways a situationist.
There's a good, fairly popular book on this. It was popular when I was in college, so it might be hard to get now, but it was a good introduction to the weird way that pop culture and these political movements actually interacted, both left and right. Going back again to Dadaism, and that's Lipstick Traces by Grail Marcus, which is a great book about the relationship of punk to both communism and fascism, because the art movements that it comes out of have relationships to both communism and fascism. And that, you have someone like McLaren, who's a total grifter, but also did have this political background, and we all know that it's almost impossible to keep grifters out of any political movement. But but there is this real relationship there that's lost in a lot of the commercialization of a lot of this music, and a lot of the aesthetics around it. And I think that's interesting because I also think you did kind of see that a little bit in these debates in the anarchist scene in the 90s, because I talk about this a lot lately, but I've mentioned that my foray into this was actually around the anti-globalization movement, which was a mixture of liberal anarchist and, in my case, paleo-conservative stuff, where I picked the wrong side eventually.
And when you say liberal anarchist, you mean like
I mean like liberal / anarchist, but I would say but there were people who overlap both milieus, like Chomsky, are to some degree Michael Albert and Z-Mag. It was very hard sometimes to tell when they were being an anarchist and when they were just being Democrats. Because yes, they had a radical theory about how society would work, but it was so far removed from what they were immediately advocating that it just didn't really matter. So I back when I used to take Bhaskar Sankara a little bit more seriously. I probably shouldn't say that, but I'm gonna leave it in. I remember when he was working for the Senate magazine and wrote about this type of person, like the Naomi Klein person, who is will throw anarchist forays out, but also social democratic forays out, and then Keynesian forays out, and then Marxist forays out, and not really seem to mean any of them. So there's a lot of that. But I remember at the time, if you got into the right circles, if you didn't get sucked into International Answer and that weirdness, and you didn't get sucked into what I got sucked into, the other thing that you could watch was the Murray Bookchin Bob Black debates.
Yep.
Which were fascinating, because I remember reading them and feeling both sides were kind of right about the other one.
And that was part of a larger. It was called the red versus green debates in general,
right?
Which was almost like a East Coast West Coast thing as well, because NEFAC was your poster child for platformist anarchism, and the West Coast definitely had nothing like that. There were some organizations that even I was part of, but I come out of that time period too, which is a weird time period. But I have to admit, these days with internet leftism, I sometimes get nostalgic for it, even though I realize nostalgia is toxic and stupid. But it's I felt like the debates were at least fleshed out, and I don't know. I mean, if you read the Bob Black Murray Bookchin debates, they comprise 800-page books. They produce a huge amount of substantive material about what was going on, even if I don't really agree with either one of them. And and I think this is also true for a lot of these polemics that we read now as mostly literature or not high theory. Were kind of internecine debates. But the thing about existentialism is why we talk about structuralism, post-structuralism. It is very much rooted in the French Academy, and the kind of expansion of the French Academy to include, kind of like in the United States, but in some ways ended up being more radical, people who were traditionally shut out of places like the Sorbonne. That turn is, I don't think we forget about that, because we think about what Pierre Bourdieu says about Bourdieu, not Alain Badiou. Keep your French people separate. This is for my audience, not for you, Jared. But what Bourdieu said about the way social competition was used with high and same verbiage and stuff amongst these post-structuralists. But the thing to remember is, even when someone is someone I dislike as much as Derrida, right? They were from groups that were traditionally excluded from the French Academy. That's also true of Camus. It's less true of Sartre. It's true. Go ahead. He was definitely part of the academy till he left it, but and then most of his career was outside of it. But he had that training and that background. He taught psychology courses before he developed his existentialism, and just as a side note. But yeah, very academic. And also at a weird time period because it's right after World War II. And, well, yeah, a little bit during, too. But that in France, anarchism was hardly visible during that whole period, which is another weird, like, did that tendency towards like an anti-authoritarian perspective get replaced by existentialism for that time, and then anarchism came back? Like, I think something might have happened there. Daniel Guerin, who I think you would like because you like Wayne Price, wrote for Modern Times.
I know Daniel Guerin's work, and yes, like you know, but you already pinned the anarchist that I like versus the anarchist that I don't. I mean, of course, all the anarchists I like are highly concessionary to Marxism, but yeah. It's interesting to look at this debate, because I will say I've encouraged people, for example, when they want to read State and Revolution, or that text by Lenin, or something like that, to go back and read Wayne Price's breakdown of the different class theories of the state, and what was actually at stake with particularly some of these groups of anarchists versus in dialogue and competition and disagreement and agreement sometimes with Marxists. Versus like the Marxists you meet who got into it from Crime Think, or who got into it from the popular version of Crime Think too, or who got into it from Chomsky or Nathan Robinson or any of those people. Like we like the people we all kind of like that even anarchists like the crap on, who are like they discover their morality and confuse it for politics. I do think that even if you come out a fairly orthodox Marxist, you actually do and should know the actual debates from these historical tendencies versus the crap you see on the internet now.
We both agree on that. I mean, I guess I'm a little sympathetic towards Marxism, but I know I've definitely been way more interested in reading Marxist material than some of the crappy anarchist stuff I see all the time. It's just it's bad. I mean, there's just a lack of interest in the history and the history of the ideas. That's terrifying.
Well, it's interesting to me that, like I told you off air, that a lot of Marxists come to crypto-Lassallean positions about the law being above class or the state being above class. Sometimes they'll have justifications based off something Lenin said specifically about the specific, state condition in like 1918 about class competition leading to something like a state that is above the class. But that's also contextually specific to a specific time period and a specific place, not generalizable to all capitalist states after 1918. And so when I hear people put into Marxist mouths like that, not that we need that maintaining the state apparatus is super important, I'm just like, you're not even really a Marxist. Like, on a fundamental level, you're kind of not. And I know that in a way we shouldn't be policing who's really what. I mean, like, that's somewhat useless actually as a sectarian matter. But you do need to understand that, like, Marx's concessions towards the state were not that you would have a state forever or even that long, because a state with a standing army and a professional apparatus implies a class,
right?
Like,
which was kind of Bakunin. Well, there's a little more to Bakunin's critique, but that was part of it,
right? Well,
Marx never got to finish his work on the state, so there's something unfortunate there.
He gave up on it. I mean, like, there's the whole like Capital was supposed to be an entire analysis of bourgeois society, and then basically what Marx learned is just trying to understand the part, not even all of the base. When people misunderstand political economy when they forget that relations of production, even in the kind of vulgar metaphor of base and superstructure, relations of production are in the base, which is not purely abstractly economic in the way that capital is, even though capital is about the development of a kind of relations of production as implied by classical political economy. But I mean, Marx wrote that, then wrote, which he only published one of, wrote what? Okay. If we include theories of surplus value in all 3 volumes of that, 6 volumes just to deal with the basics of bourgeois economy. So, and he never finished most of it. And he was also never completely comfortable on political stuff, honestly. I mean, and I say this, when he would do polemics on contemporary politics for the newspaper, he would often actually ask Engels to flesh out the political sections.
Yeah, it seems like Engels, actually, a lot of the things anarchists don't like about Marx are from Engels's pen.
Yeah, but to salvage Engels a little bit, Engels did insist on stuff like socialization and nationalization aren't the same thing, and was really mad at the Erfurt program for not understanding this. And our Althusserian is screaming, but we'll in the comment section, but we'll have to do that later. I know what these people's tendencies are. So, one thing I would say is that the idea, one of the things I would say that I think is interesting about this existentialist stuff, though, is that you actually do work out that you think it does have immediate, for lack of a better term, policy implications for Marxists and anarchists if you were to actually try to apply it now. Would you like to talk about what that would mean, particularly when Marxists and anarchists and the broader left seems very lost in the post-Trump era? I mean, people will deny this, but if you watch, I mean, you just have to watch Twitter or go to a DSA meeting or anything, and everyone seems completely lost as to what to do now.
Well, so, I mean, that type of thinking I'm developing really comes from 2 different directions. One is that if you're going to do a social ontology that comes out of Sartre, really, so he's got this theory of he calls it the practico-inert, and what he means by this is that what is the result of the way that human beings interacting with the world produces, kind of like the way that laboring on materials produces a product. Sartre had more of a expanded idea of just any type of activity that was directed at the interaction with the material world, for lack of a better term, produces what he called the world as practico-inert, an inert world that is still shaped by consciousness. And this is sort of his dialectic. And he uses this to explain how we have something like language, or how we have various institutions. But to me, seems pretty obvious that one of the things that human beings produce in their practical activity are legal systems. And it seems like that's the big disconnect between a lot of contemporary socialists and what might be thought of as an existentialist understanding of how history develops. So laws come to be written down embodiments of conscious, intentional activity. And so whether or not you're an anarchist, there's still something about constitution making or law making that is a creative practice that requires the freedom of the imagination and action to carry out. So, and it also, for some Marxists, materialism is everything, and they really want to analyze, factors of production and things like that. But
materialism is understood largely as factors of production, and by limiting it to pure production capacity, which is a critique that I take from anarchists that I think is actually fair. One that I also think that there are hints that Marx did see the problem there, like the talk, like for example, including relations and production, which are largely actually legal categories historically speaking.
Right. Exactly. This is exactly the thing.
In the base of society, except for in capital, like that's and both anarchist, existentialist, and neo-chartalist all push back on that, saying that if we do, if you don't look at law, you don't really understand what's going on. Neo-chartalists kind of have I'm not going to say they have a no class view of the law, but they do kind of see the law as above class relations, which I think is absurd. But
yeah, that's absurd.
Some of them will kind of say something, about how the law exists in a class context, but they treat the law as if it is not a manifestation of power, but like a creation of community. Even when you go into the implications of their monetary theory being like, yeah, people take money because you make them, because you provided credit or had debts, and you did that at gunpoint or sure. Spear point, as the case may be. Like, so.
But, I mean, I don't know. There's just a lack of, again, it comes back to not knowing history a lot of the time. Like if you look at the history of the if you look at the colonial period of the United States, you see like how legal systems were forming in the different colonies and what class was creating them, and the interaction between, the British appointed governors and sort of like these assemblies that were formed to basically govern themselves.
Right. And they also have, just as a side note, what the neo-chartalists and MMTers focus on is the fact that these classes had like, they did not have commodity money actually a lot of times in the colonial period. A lot of it was fiat currency and then would be transferred into commodity money, and they would like destroy certain amounts of it to keep ward off inflation, et cetera and so forth. But they often treat this as value neutral, or as like just a policy decision with no power implications whatsoever, which to me is nutsoid. Like, it's just like, no, they were doing that for a reason. There's also a reason why you had to have property to like vote. Like, well, it's all tied together.
No, exactly. Like, no, like conscription, voting, and the original suffrage movement was just a movement for every man to vote. It wasn't even, it was just to get rid of the property standard. But yeah, I mean, even beyond that though, yes, it comes out of a certain class, but law is also ultimately rooted in philosophy. So when you start changing some of your fundamental assumptions about human society and responsibility and all these basic questions that come up in existentialism, you have to wind up eventually changing the way you apply those assumptions to conflict resolution or property in general as a question, and things like that. So what that application tends to look like is writing something down, and what that written down thing tends to be called is policy.
Right. So you made the argument that anarchists, and I guess you'd also extend that to Marxist, even if they're totally abstentionist, like even if they don't believe in participating in electoral politics whatsoever, they would still have to deal with policy.
Right. Exactly. Like if I make the argument that, the democratic governing of the commons is still basically a policy creating act.
Right. I mean, like if you think about even into the furthest reaches of not just between like Trotskyism, Stalinism, social democracy, but even in like, say, left comland, which I did a primer on with someone else a couple weeks ago, the divisions between councilism, confederated syndicalism, and organic centralism, whatever that is, are huge policy differences on how you administer what they would all claim to be a nation stateless society.
Right. Well, okay, and even to say the term nation state opens up this whole world of what these socialist thinkers were dealing with at the 19th century.
19th, early 20th century, yeah.
Yeah, what all the nation states were forming. It wasn't like that shit existed yet. So
yeah, I mean,
they were watching like the legal and military regime come into being based on John Locke and Rousseau, and like seeing why these bourgeois thinkers would ultimately wind up screwing over the class of laborers that were becoming the proletariat.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to watch John Locke. I mean, because I have some socialist friends of mine who really want to defend Lockean provisos, but then I'm always like, I don't believe he ever believed any of that. Like, one, he wrote the South Carolina, or at least helped co-write the South Carolina Colonial Charter, which has slavery in it. So self-ownership seems hard to square with that. I know I know he does have an out, and I know what the out is, but it just seems unserious. And B, he literally watched the enclosures, so he can't claim that the peasants they're enclosing from weren't using and improving the land. But he exists during the time period in which that is happening. So unlike, libertarian idiots who exist when this is in the deep past are, seemingly in the deep past. It's not in the United States, but they'll pretend it is. It's a live question for John Locke, right? And it's one where he's actually creating a myth that is in direct contradiction to what is happening in his lifetime.
Isn't that true for Adam Smith as well? Wasn't he, or was that just how his thinking was used?
That's how his thinking was used. Like the thing about Smith's primary concern in terms of class war was to get rid of the rentier class, which was like the last vestiges of the feudal rents. Right.
Okay. Sure. Right.
And so his concern for like mercantilism is actually a concern for people who he feels truly parasite off the land because they literally just have the land by legal fiat, and you serve them. Like, and so that's his concern. I tend to be somewhat sympathetic to the Smith as more radical than we give him credit for. Reading. However, I also think that they're just bourgeois myths in Smith, because Smith thinks, for example, that you can keep political administration and economic administration separate. Like his laissez-faire is not only should government not affect the market, but also it's supposed to go in the other direction too. The market's not supposed to affect the government. And you think about like, how the hell would that work? Because you're also assuming that taxes are funding this. Like there's some sort of taxation, even if it's tariffs are funding this, like, so that's kind of a non-starter. So you have similar contradictions, but to me, it's not as blatant as like the enclosures, justify property. Oh, let's just say that use justifies property and ignore the fact that the people we're taking this from were using the land. So
So I think so. So to draw that back in, I think existentialism definitely, throws a wrench into these naturalistic arguments about property, which would be natural law, natural rights, the social contract, all that stuff. How do you don't get that? What if existence precedes essence, right?
Right. So I mean, the existential intervention, it does just say like natural law is horse shit, basically. And it's interesting to me what you've seen with liberals. Okay, just as a side note, a lot of liberals still believe in this Lockean tradition, but I actually think the conservative critique, the natural law conservative critique, is actually somewhat fair from their own framework. Most of them justify this upon utilitarian norms or human rights norms, which becomes a substitute for natural law. But they can't. Modern liberals still pull from this Lockean proviso, right? Okay. They still believe in the social contract. They still largely believe in self-ownership. They still largely kind of only see class as is epiphenomenal to society, not as phenomenal. And so,
right.
So it's something that's unfortunate, but maybe we can tweak it away. It's not based on the basic functioning of how we socially reproduce ourselves, right? But they don't believe in God, so they can't appeal to natural law.
Right. At least it's not a part of their it's not really a part of their ideology, even though they're gonna make the claim when running for office or something.
Right. Or they do on stuff like human rights, but they can't actually they defend human rights largely actually on natural law grounds without saying so, but can't actually it usually becomes circular. Human rights are good because they are human rights, and then you're like, well, okay, if I base this off of inalienability, right? Like human rights are inalienable. Like you can't, they're obvious and they're natural, right? But most of you believe that in some degree, even though you clearly don't. So why do you need to protect them by law if those two conditions are true without a theological justification? And the question just becomes basically they'll try to do a utilitarian justification of it, right, which upon any deep consideration totally falls apart. Like it's just like, there's no way to mathematically calculate that in any meaningful sense. It's not a meaningful assertion. So I think existentialism is radical in that, and most people don't think about the radicalness because even if they're religious, they pretty much assume that we do not have, I don't know anyone who's not a diehard traditionalist Catholic who really truly believes in natural law.
Well, when did Christians even begin to accept that as an argument? Like this would be, well, I guess they accepted it with the bourgeois revolutions, right?
Right. It's a bourgeois revolution argument, right? Because prior to that, I mean, there is the beginnings of it in an Aquinian, late medieval thinking, but that's really late medieval thinking. It's not medieval thinking. And it's also the beginnings of it. And Aquinas more or less abandons it. Like the whole natural law argument there is that, God created a reasonable universe.
And science is how you discover the reason behind
which he got from actually late Islamic thinkers and the one of the Islamic reformations, right? So which is an Islamic reading of Aristotle. not to just put the intellectual history gloss on it, I'm still a Marxist. I think the fact that this is coming up at the beginning of nation states in France and England is kind of important, and
Absolutely.
the end of the Crusades. Like I would still say that doesn't get you out of the, oh, this is proto-bourgeois, because it is still proto-bourgeois. Like, so this is where you can see the kind of lineage between the old world and the new, right? And by
I think this is not exactly following from what you said, but it is on the topic. The national question is what it used to be called, the question of nationalism. We're seeing that come back with a fury, and I don't think the left knows how to handle it at all.
To pick up on this in the modern context, I think you're absolutely correct. Partially, and I would say partially because historically speaking, we have had a double answer to it. Internationalism has been about using nationalism to break apart empires, but then under the assumption that the nationalists would, with relative self-autonomy, come together to form non-state polities or eventually post-state polities.
Like the Western assumption was that by encouraging nationalist groups, they would also, along with their nationalism, adopt liberal democracy and Republican values, which those things did not go together necessarily.
I was about to say they didn't even necessarily go together at the time they were doing it. So like you think about Italian nationalism only really succeeds when they drop the liberal part and concede it. And I would also say part of this is the entire Western culture's over focus on England and France. To bring this up in the context of like right now, I don't normally talk about my job, but I'm going to, because this is a story that came up last week. I had a teacher who came to me and was like, "Hey, Varn, would you say that America is the first country based off on idea instead of based off nationhood? Because, you know, they're the French and the Germans and the whatever." And I'm like, well, no, I wouldn't actually say that at all, because Germany didn't even exist yet. And also German culture, the unification of German culture itself is a product of the nationalization process that washed out the difference between the Frisians and the Frisians and the Tyroleans and the Prussians and the Bavarians, and in certain and the Saxons, et cetera, and in certain areas, those regionalisms, which are also kind of micro-nationalisms, still exist to this day. They have never been fully purged.
Including here.
The South is the obvious one, but I think it's true. Like, if you really study, I don't buy the reasoning behind the 15 nations, thesis in the United States.
Okay.
Which is largely ethnic, but I do like in a way that's a little icky when you think about some of the racial implications of it. But
are you talking about like Colin Woodard?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I do think there's a truth to the fact that historical differences between peoples, even between white peoples, quote unquote, that are even lost on the people there now, that like they don't remember, like we don't remember that, oh, we were Scotch Irish and New Englanders were English and we hated them.
For the most part. Well, that's, to me, that is what the whiteness project
was designed to do, was to get rid of those like interregional tensions, but it doesn't do it completely.
No.
And anyone who travels extensively and lives anywhere in the U.S. for a couple of times will tell you, no, it really doesn't. Like, I mean, I live in an extreme example of it. I moved from the South to Pennsylvania to Ohio to lived abroad for 10 years and then moved to Mormonlandia, right? But like,
which I am also from.
You're from Mormonlandia, right?
Not Utah, but I'm from a suburb in Gilbert, which is a Mormon founded.
So greater Mormonlandia.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and those distinctions are really different, and there are ways in which, like, I think this is underappreciated by Americans. It's underappreciated by American left. It's underappreciated by American liberal press. It's kind of even underappreciated by American conservatives, although they actually do seem to be the one group that occasionally is able to make hay of it.
Yeah, they are. It's
yeah. So
the right. That has been the official project, to get rid of the old world mindset of that kind of a regionalism. Someone in the chat is bringing up Colin Woodard, the thesis excluding African Americans. He does actually at one point talk about why that wasn't brought into his major work, and he has done other work on that, on the various cultural geography.
He basically, I mean, the long and short of it is he basically thinks the white part of the South and the black part of the South were significantly enough different cultures to you would have to map them separately. Something that I think is actually kind of a contentious claim, because I am one of the believers that, like, Southern culture and African and post slave African American culture highly overlaps in ways that are separate because of segregation and Jim Crow and a variety of other reasons, but can't really be separated. Like, for example, that it was a mutually informed cultural exchange. Like, words like y'all come from like West England down through the Scotch Irish area and into Black dialect, whereas there's also Black like African dialectical patterns that show up in Southern English that don't show up anywhere else in US English. I always used to laugh when people would say Ebonics was another language. People remember the 90s Ebonics category, and classifying it as another language was actually an attempt to get money. No one actually really believed it, by the way.
Hasn't also the linguistic studies on dialects found like tons of different dialects? It's not just one.
No, there's several different Black dialects, because segregation was all throughout the country, right. And also different African groups settled in different areas, even arbitrarily. What I was always laugh about that is when people would say, well, white kids can't pass an Ebonics test. And I was like, unless they're from the Deep South.
Right. Which
I definitely understood everything that was said. I was like, yeah, totally. Like, I like, except for three phrases, I talk the same way when I'm at home. So it's an interesting thing to look at. I think Marxists tend to, I even think they do this with class, frankly, even within the working class. They tend to take a fundamental division, which is absolutely true, and probably the primary dividing division, but then not look at any other divisions because it's somewhat inconvenient, which is also why they don't always understand things like class aspirational battles or intersection. I can't even say the word intersectional anymore because it's used in a different way now, but the battles between different sections of the economy that are like almost permanent, even amongst workers, and stuff like that. It's because, like, in some ways we don't want to deal with sociology because it's somewhat inconvenient.
Well, here's an interesting way to talk about that problem is how much work from Marxists has been done about anti-communism in the United States. It's like probably one of the largest forces in shaping the political landscape in the United States has been anti-communism for a century. And like
Marxists complain about it, but they don't actually do that much deep analysis of it other than saying it was bad and it was a thing.
Right.
And also, I mean, I've only read one Marxist who actually, and like I said, many people consider Christopher Lasch a right-wing Marxist, if a Marxist at all. But Christopher Lasch's primary concern in his early period, so before Culture of Narcissism, is liberal and left response to the Russian Revolution and why anti-communism came so easily to the United States.
I'll have to read that. Yeah, I'm very interested in that history.
His first book is a dissertation that even I didn't think was that important until I started reading it, and it's American Liberals in the Russian Revolution. That's what he started writing about. Then he started writing about why the socialist and populist movement were sucked into progressivism as revitalization projects of bourgeois liberalism from specific subclass.
Do you mean, when you say that, are you talking about like urban planning?
No, I'm talking about urban planning, but also like the end of even promoting stuff like the myth of entrepreneurial capital, which really begins with Teddy Roosevelt. And so like he says that like urban planning, redistributed policies, social goods, these are all like recuperated by progressives from the populist and socialist and anarchist movements. But they're done so in ways that are conducive towards Fordist capital. And then later on in the end of his life, he's like, and Fordism is a bridge into neoliberalism, actually. So it's an interesting book. I don't agree. I mean, I don't agree with all his conclusions, actually, and I'm writing a book on him, so I talk about him all the time. But
I hear you bring him up all the time.
But I also bring him up because his fans, like the fans of Sartre, often don't really understand what he's doing. Like they read the hits, which sound very self-helpy, like culture of narcissism. People hit. They even in the title they hit on the narcissism part and not the culture of, or they think it's like a voluntaristic problem. Like, oh, we all became narcissists because we're all self-obsessed because we're assholes. And like the actual thesis of the book is like, no, capitalism has restricted social space to the point that there's no community space for you to invest in. So you don't really have any choice but to invest your identity into yourself. And thus, like,
I talk about that all the time. Isn't that sort of a Debord kind of atomization?
Yeah, Debord. I think a whole lot of people in the 50s started seeing this. Like, and
the lonely crowd, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, except that like Debord, Lasch is coming at it from a specifically socialist, and I think at that point he admits to being a Marxist. Early on, he's cagey about it because it's still the height of the Cold War, or the end of the Cold War in the early 60s. So like, but he never hides that he's a socialist, and you don't find many critiques of Marx. You do find critiques of the USSR in Lasch, particularly after the 30s and 40s, so during like the high period of Stalinism, but you don't find critiques of Marx. And you also, interestingly enough, Lasch thinks that the people who became anti-communist Marxist or anti-communist leftists were traitors, even though he doesn't support. He doesn't think the USSR was probably, properly speaking, functional Marxist society.
And he's not writing about America, right? Or is he?
No, he's only writing about America. He doesn't deal with it. What he deals with is the American intervention. Like, so for example, the Congress on Cultural Freedom, where you took a bunch of Marxists from the 30s and 40s and sent them on which he suspected was CIA money but couldn't prove, but now we've actually proven was OSS and CIA money, to Europe to do anti-communist work under the guise of liberalism.
Right. And as art movements, right?
Yeah, as art movements. Yeah. And he basically accuses them of selling out to the state for anti-communist, for just crass anti-communist reasons. And, there are some historians who've talked about this in the last 20 years, but like he wrote this in the 60s. So it's only 10 years in the past when he's writing it. And it's kind of wild that this is not remembered. What everyone remembers is like, Culture of Narcissism post or his last book, which was a book that his frankly conservative daughter curated with him. And there's debates over how much no one thinks that she wrote it. Like it's even a case like with like Nietzsche's sister, where you have someone turning it reactionary. but there is debates over whether or not he actually wanted it published it in the state it was in. It was published posthumously, and I have several interviews with people who knew him and said he was not happy with the state of the manuscript and probably didn't want to see it in print. And that's the manuscript that all the populists go to, right? Not his early stuff where he explicitly critiques populism. So it's interesting because I actually do see a parallel with Sartre, and I also think it's interesting how these ideas are convergent. Lash was actually conversant in the Frankfurt School and in existentialism, and he even references Foucault. He doesn't write like a post-structuralist or a postmodernist, so people don't realize it because he just writes normally. Like he's not using neoliberalism, or like he uses neoliberalism actually, but he's not using a lot of neolisms. Excuse me, let me get these things correctly to make his point. I mean, we've kind of diverted off topic, but I think your point about law is well taken, and I wish more Marxists took it seriously.
Right, and it goes back to what you were basically saying is that there's an emphasis on there's so much of an emphasis on certain parts of the.
Well, materialism is taken to mean economics, as somehow the economics don't involve social relations, and social relations are seen as epiphenomenal or superstructural. Which one? The base superstructure actually is a feedback loop metaphor. So even that reading of the most vulgar forms is still a misreading. But two, relations of production are part of the base. And so when I say that, people are like, well, you don't understand Marx. And I'm like, no, it's relations of production are part of the base. Otherwise, what you'd be saying is like, when people say shit like feudal society was classless, it just had caste. And I'm like, no, it's not. Marx doesn't believe that. Like, Marx does not say that the history of all society is the history of class conflict cannot be true if class is only a term that applies to capitalism.
Right.
Like,
yeah, I don't know how. I always thought that the base superstructure thing was a feedback system, because isn't that the whole factory system is sort of like how Marx, or at least Marxists, explain the rise of the class consciousness?
Right.
The factory system brings together all these people and into social relations.
And you need institutions and stuff to reaffirm those social relations. They're not automatic. That's a difference between Marxism and certain forms of anarchism. Although, again, anarchism is, I get really mad at Marxists about this. Anarchism is much harder to generalize about because it's more than one theory, and some of which are radically opposed to each other. So
yeah, well, and I don't think many people understand Proudhon. Including anarchists, and especially that speak English. One of the big reasons is the guy wrote like 50 volumes. And what's available in English is like, I don't know, 3 books that cover like the beginning of his career. And then, the poverty of philosophy is not a good faith argument against Proudhon.
Would you like to go into that a little bit?
Well, this isn't fresh on my mind, but from what I understand, a lot of Marxist concepts about the way that surplus is created in labor, and instead of that value being distributed back to the workers, the value of the surplus is distributed among the owners. It's a Proudhonian argument. But from what I understand is that in the poverty of philosophy, Marx basically is attacking Proudhon for not understanding that, which he did, or something along those lines. There's a lot of cases of straw manning Proudhon, or just.
Well, I mean, one thing I would say about 18th and 19th century polemics is they're almost all straw men. Like,
yeah.
Like, it's it's kind of frustrating actually, because we take these at face value a lot of the time, and if you actually try to reconcile them, even what Marx did and whom like Marx was talking to and what compromises they made, it doesn't make a lot of sense if you don't tone it down in your own mind. That said, I mean, for example, like Marx was totally willing to work with Proudhonus in the International.
Yes, exactly.
For a long time. I mean, he does have a point where he thinks it's not useful anymore, but it's really the Bakutinists that really piss him off.
Right. Yeah. And people, even, and then Bakunin's another topic, which, people don't realize how into Hegel Bakunin was.
Yeah.
Marx, the copy of Hegel's works that Marx read was given to him by Bakunin. This is like how crazy the actual lives of these early socialists are.
Well, I mean, like, yeah. You think about the fact that, like, Bakunin, Wagner, and arch reactionary racist nationalists and Engels are all like near each other in 1848, like literally taking up arms. And actually, it's something that Bakunin would throw at Marx, is Marx is the only one of those individuals who was not in the health to fight and didn't. So
right.
But yeah, I think this is good stuff. The history this goes into, like we talked about, this kind of misunderstanding of partial understanding, I think super informs our misunderstandings about the post-war years too. I mean, we're back in deep socialist history now, but when you look at the existentialist post-structuralist debates, as we said, a lot of this is lost, and they often didn't seem to understand each other. Or they were deliberately misrepresenting each other's arguments. There is a sense also that you see this move from polemics into the academy, which is true across the board, and then back out from the academy, back out into like the thing is, if you say, oh, it's just academic Marxism, like some Trotskyists will occasionally do, that's also not fair, because these people were interacting with real communist parties and they had effect on real communist parties too. So it's and anarchist groups, etc. So it was not also totally cloistered in the academy, particularly in a place like the Sorbonne, where like lectures were free to the public. Like,
sure. Or like the Communist Party came out on top of the Nazi invasion of France, the occupation, and they were highly revered for a long time because of that.
Right, because they were the right side of the popular front, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, and they like it was you really had to be a conservative to not be in some way for the PCF at that point.
Right. You had to basically be a Vichy sympathizer. Like,
yeah. Yep.
So just to kind of, because we've been all over the place, so I'm gonna like roadmap it we're gonna wrap up here, but I'm gonna roadmap it for our listeners. You think that existentialism should be reconsidered, that its unpopularity is kind of a mixture of our association of it with the arts because of the Beats and other people in the United States, the fact that it kind of got lost out to the battle with post-structuralism, and we didn't talk about this, but I should have added it. Post-structuralists were brought to America by academic institutions in ways that some of the existentialists were not. So like, I don't think Sartre was ever given a full professorship at like Stanford, right? Like, or anything like that. And that was definitely true with some of the post-structuralists. So that's another consideration. That this actually does have policy implications, and policy we need to define more broadly than just liberal electoralism. Like, the way you administer communist society is effectively, or any kind of post-capitalist society, to be super conclusive if people don't like the C word, is still would involve policy decisions. Like the administration of things in Marx does not get you out of policy. It might get you out of politics as class politics, but it doesn't get you out of policy debates.
Or you might be able to get rid of representation. Even,
right.
But you're still doing policy.
Right. So policy is always with us. And then other digressions where we need to understand the history of these movements more thoroughly than we do, which is like almost always my calling card is like, yeah, there's more to know. That a lot of these debates are both incomplete because we study the polemics, but also because so much of it, even though it's in readily available languages that are commonly spoken, even in the United States, a fairly monolingual culture, it's not like people are asking people to translate stuff from Eritrean. Like this is French, or even Arabic. So we need more of these texts to be translated and understood, and we need to approach them in their own context. Anything else you'd like to add to my summary?
No, I mean that was a pretty good summary there.
Yeah, I try whenever I feel we're going all over the place and we haven't hit the 5-hour mark or something crazy, and I can't even begin to. I try to summarize this up for my listeners to kind of get the big ideas. So I'd like to thank you, Jared. I think you're going to come back online because I think there's still a whole lot of stuff you write about that we haven't really talked about yet. If people want to find you, they can find you at Cyber Dandy, and there's a news feed associated with that. It's like Everything's Dandy or.
Yeah.
What is it called?
cyberdandy.org. And then there's a link to a news feed. I'm regularly just putting whatever I'm interested in into.
And you started like the rest of us fools. You moved to the tubes a couple of times. And where's that at?
Still working on it. It's still what my ongoing focus is going to be. I'm pretty much moving away from writing, and just I have not been happy with the anarchist presence on various tubes.
Oh well, I have no doubt. Like, if you think Marxists are mad at anarchists, you listen to old anarchists complain about new anarchists. It'll make you feel better.
Yeah.
It's just like, oh, I'm not the only person who complains about these people. I think people should check you out once you get that up and running, and we'll probably have you back on in the future. Probably will pick back up existentialism because I also think it's more intellectually interesting than it's treated in high school in the United States. Even though I have my critiques of Sartre, and I mean, one thing I will say is I think behaviorally, Sartre does become somewhat of a dubious figure at times in his history, in ways that we do have to kind of deal with.
Sure.
But I would tell people, if you're gonna pick up stuff from Team France, all right, please, the mid 50s and 60s stuff is probably a better use of your time than some of the 80s and 90s stuff.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. I'd like to thank you for coming on, Jared. We will also release this as a podcast, but I'm going to edit it a little bit before that's the case. Or my producer Paul will, or we both will. And so I'll tell you when that's up. And I thank you for coming on. Thank you for your time.
Cool. Thank you for having me.
All right. Awesome.
Talk to you later.
Talk to you later. Right. In broadcast.